My name is Andrew Woodfield, and I will be your host today. On today's episode, we have Mark Pollard, who is a major leader in the world of strategy. Mark is CEO of Sweathead, a community of nearly 20,000 strategists worldwide, as well as a hub of resources, events, and trainings. He's the host of Sweathead Podcast, a podcast on all things strategy. It is in its sixth year with over 1.5 million listens. Congratulations on that. CEO of Mighty Jungle, author of Strategy is Your Words, a 400-page strategy Bible of tactics and frameworks that has sold thousands of copies around the world, and all in all, an amazing human being with so much value to share. Welcome to the podcast, Mark. It's a pleasure to have you on today.
Thanks, mate. It's your first podcast. How you feeling?
I'm feeling good. It's just another conversation. It's just we're recording this one and streaming it, and once it compiles and we get to hundreds of episodes, I wonder if anyone will ever actually hear it. But we'll share it out with the world and we'll see.
I'm sure they will. I'm sure at least two people will listen to it.
The three in this room.
Yeah. And look, that's, when you're doing podcasts, you have to do it as a lifestyle choice. And because you have expressive and social needs, and maybe two people listen to it, maybe 1,000 do, maybe 10,000 do. But at some point, that's not the point.
Love that. At some point, that's not the point. Exactly. I'd like to pass the mic over to you. There's been a lot of stuff going on in your life professionally and personally, I'm sure, but professionally over the past year. So as you're reflecting over your past year of travel, events, trainings, and interacting with different people and perspectives from around the world, what's been on your mind?
For me, there's these two buckets of opposite emotions. I've been taught in, done events in Georgia, the country, not the state, Turkey, Bulgaria twice, Mexico City, Ecuador, Brazil, and Peru. I think that's everything. Everywhere I go, the people I meet through this industry, through the line of work that I do, they're awesome people, beautiful people, kind of slightly crazy. They have a lot of interests. They're into life. They're kind of nerds. And at the same time, a lot of them are living in these countries that feel like they're falling apart, where there can be a lot of corruption, a lot of mafia influence, or maybe influence from external powers. And so when I'm with them, I kind of feel that combination of energy at all times. It's beautiful and optimistic and also anxious and scary. And, people want their countries to join Europe, or they want their countries to kick out, particular influences from particular parts of the world. So there's all of this energy that goes on. And then when it comes to just thinking through what to do about it in the next year or two, the planning phase that we're in right now it's interesting. I think we're going to focus, do a little bit less. We were quite ambitious with the programming we were trying to do with our online classes and master classes and things this year. We'll probably do a little bit less of that. I'll probably bring in fewer guest teachers and be more of a teacher myself. So this is the constellation of stuff that's on my mind right now.
Very nice, and thank you for sharing. I was looking through your recent post on Instagram where you were talking about what you're focusing on this upcoming year. So it's basically a repeat of what you've done this year, just around again with the accelerator and some of the programs and trainings that you've done, which is pretty amazing. There was a couple that stood out to me, which was helping in-house teams work better together and helping people step into leadership roles. So I wanted to hear a bit more about what led your focus and what you're interested in on those two topics. And in regards to in-house teams working better together, there is this productive and sometimes not so productive tension that can take place, especially in future technologies and in startups, between leadership and product design, development, and strategy mixed in there as well. I'd love to hear more about what your goals are in that space and also how those dynamics come into play.
All right, that's 10 questions at once, Andrew, but we'll fix you by the end of this episode.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Look, I'm 45 now, and I started in the industry when I was 20, and I spent about 10 years mostly focused on digital products. So writing really complicated functional specifications for online training programs for the car manufacturer Audi, as well as an e-commerce project for them, then in marketing projects as well, sending out email newsletters on behalf of big, Unilever clients, etc. So I've sort of been very much around that digital world, and then added more brand strategy or account planning in the advertising sense as I got a little bit older. And so I've been in a lot of situations, and since I was young, I've published. When I was 20, I published a magazine for a bunch, did radio. Now I publish books or on my own company. And so I go into a lot of companies, and often it's through the front door of we want to write better creative briefs or be more creative. And I'll start to notice the dynamics between maybe it's an in-house agency and how they interact with their product marketers, how they interact with maybe brand marketers. And then, yes, in a younger tech company, there's always a CEO who wants authorship of everything and who often drives people crazy. So I've seen that. And then I've also seen the dynamics in even bigger places, like global companies. And there's just a lot of people going in-house because the agency world I don't think it's in the healthiest place right now. So a lot of people are going in-house and they're buying a story that they're telling themselves, which is they'll be able to get better work-life balance. They won't have to do crazy hours. Maybe they get to see their friends, families a little bit more often, their pets, whatever they're into. But what they end up doing is having to develop political skills or getting stuck in bureaucracy or settling for mediocrity just to survive. And so I'm looking to develop a program and publish a book next year that will be about that in-house experience. I'll be interviewing probably 20 to 30 people in the next 2 weeks, and then I'll look at quantifying the research through a survey and then trying to create a program around it. It's really, really interesting. I think that trend of people moving in-house or in-house teams getting bigger and bigger, I don't think that's going to reverse anytime soon. So it makes sense from a business point of view to be there, but also I've done a lot of work in that space and think I can add something.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's great. And a lot of my previous experiences in enterprise level as well, so I can completely relate to that. There's something interesting that you're sharing is that a lot of people are moving in-house. Are you speaking about that from like the enterprise level bringing people in, or are you talking about from the individual level wanting to be more incorporated at larger enterprises versus in-house enterprises versus like at agencies?
Yeah, so there's sort of conflicting data out there about all of this. I think the story for 2023 with most big advertising agency holding companies is the growth is not coming from their creative agencies or their advertising agencies. They're trying to often acquire growth, or there might be growth through media or some of the technology companies that they're buying and bringing in. But then there's also a bit of a flight from advertising to non-advertising companies, or what we would say is client side or brand side or in-house, right? Those three phrases get used. It's funny. Yeah. It's a very agency-centric way of seeing the world. And, at the same time, with the sort of tech implosion this year, a lot of people who've gone in-house have lost jobs as well. So this year is just a weird year, generally speaking, to analyze any of this in a meaningful way. The long-term trend will be that these companies will continue to bring people who've worked in agencies in, but also they'll be bringing people fresh out of college in to do roles that were usually in agencies. And those people aren't going to touch the kinds of culture that we all grew up in. And I think that's going to lead to more of a corporate approach to creativity, which is not a thing. It's a paradox. It's not a thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And the reason why I was poking on that a little bit is I've been on the other side of things, especially in tech, where we're all very familiar with the volatility and the flux that's going on around the world. Like even in the past year, I've been unemployed 3 times for whatever reason that the company had. And I spoke to a leader in design who was part of the first wave during when all this started during COVID, who decided to go out on his own and start an independent agency. And he was kind of speaking to, we were chatting like a few weeks ago about how, at least in the design and product side of the world, it seems to be, and maybe it's temporary, like you're referring to, it seems to be a trend where individuals are spinning off and creating these more value-focused, mission-driven studios or agencies for creative work, and that they're partnering with some of these companies that now have these really, really large voids. Does that play into like the temporary side of where things are heading in your prediction?
Yeah, I guess we're in more of a fractious or fragmented world, but also that kind of person in a small company of their own or freelancer, a lot of them are struggling for work right now as well. So I'm again, it depends. It's hard without actual numbers to say here's exactly what's going on. But I'm hearing, and I've heard a lot of stories over the past 12 months of people who've been doing sort of strategy work, not so much product strategy work, but more like brand and advertising strategy work, becoming long-term unemployed, especially if they're a little bit older, maybe fearing they're not going to get another job. And then, you see these people launch podcasts and newsletters and get really active on LinkedIn just to try to shake the tree a little bit. And, I've seen these cycles over the years, over the past decade plus.
Interesting.
And so we're in a little bit of a shaking of the tree phase. And I think in the Northern Hemisphere, at the very least, in Western countries, it's going to be a difficult winter. December, January, February are usually really, really quiet months. And then you maybe get a couple of months in September, and then people disappear for July and August. And then you might get a little bit of activity September, October, November. And so for people who are kind of navigating that stuff for the very first time, it's hard. It's really hard because you don't have long-term context. And obviously in the backs of our mind is how much of this is structural? Is it about the next 12 months, or is this how it's going to be for the next decade or two? And I think it's pretty structural, the stuff that's going on right now. And it will lead to a lot of people needing to invent different kinds of lives in a way that in other countries they actually take for granted. So, for example, some of the countries I've been in, like Brazil, they pride themselves on maybe working in a similar industry to us, but also maybe DJing on the side, or, my book translator translates big events. He's a male model and a DJ and a music producer. I mean, this stuff's super, super common outside of the US. I feel like typically in the US, people have one career, one focus. But maybe we're going to need to see people having like a bundle of skills that they can bring to life, to bring themselves to life, but also to have a livelihood, to earn money.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. And especially in the realm of creativity, or at least a personal opinion that I've held and I've had conversations around recently, is the perceived advantage of people, the creative-minded individuals that have a couple of different interests or realms of expertise or hobbies, and they could stretch their creativity muscles. And I find that it adds this dynamism when you're in strategic or problem-solving scenarios. It helps you connect dots better. It helps you think differently and think outside of the box. But I've also observed myself and heard of others that have observed the same, and again, based in the States. So I'd be interested to hear if this is a global thing where it's kind of frowned upon to, like, it's hard for people to conceive, like, oh, I do a few different things, or like, yeah, I can, think about strategy, but also like strategy with product design, but also I'm interested in building businesses, and also I'm interested in like music production. It's like, well, how does all that fit together? Sort of thing.
Yeah, there's something in the US mindset, and it's not exclusive to the US, but there's definitely a US mindset that comes through in this phrase, swimming lanes. So a lot of people who move here in this industry, we've often had relatively general roles because we're in smaller markets, but we're ambitious, right? And so I was a digital producer back in the days when there weren't many strategists at all. I did the strategy, I did the user experience, I managed the accounts, I managed the team, I presented the thinking. Like we kind of did everything that wasn't design and development.
Yeah.
Those roles don't really exist unless you run your own company now. And so one of the complaints I hear from a lot of people when they move here is, I used to do 5 to 10 things and now I just do email. And one way, if you ever really want to glitch an American recruiter, I'm not anti-American, but if you ever want to glitch an American recruiter, you tell them that you do other things. And they're like, we're looking for someone who's worked who's done strategy for cars, who's lived in Detroit, who's 25 to 28 and a half years old and who owns 2 dogs. Like that, I can't go off script with that. And now I'm glitching. So there's something very, very focused, which is powerful in some ways, but also very limiting of the US individual. It's weird. It's such a contradiction, right? Because this is the number one most individualistic country in the world. Individual. But you're allowed to be an individual in a relatively strict way. There's a bit of a tension there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So let's talk about individuals and dive into that second intention that you have for the upcoming year in regards to helping people step into more leadership roles. How does that play into kind of this world that we were just talking about? and what's your overall mission with it?
Well, the overall mission, generally speaking, is to try to help people not squander their talent, their potential. So let's say that you are an individual and you're into DJing and car racing and parrots and strategy. Have at it. Bring all those things together, and that'll make you more interesting in life. It'll give you a more interesting life, and it'll make you a better strategy leader. Whereas I feel like people have to act these roles and they cut all this stuff off so that they can be basically like a paper cutout of what they think they're supposed to be. And that's super uninteresting. And so, when we're talking about strategists becoming leaders, it's such a young industry. I mean, most agencies that I get around, everybody's in their 20s, except when I was in Iceland recently, where in, I think, the Nordics and then Scandinavia, people can start careers a little bit late. They can have babies really early. They can go to college late. Maybe they get a job 25 to 26 to 27, right? It's a little bit different from what I knew, having been in the industry since I was 20. But a lot of these people, they're 25, 26, 27, starting to get roles where they might manage other people. That's still so young. Like, you don't even know yourself at that age for the most part, right? And so how are you going to manage other people? And because they don't know, and because the people they report into are probably only a few years older than them and don't coach them because they're not capable necessarily themselves, you just get these toxic environments of people acting like a boss rather than actually being a leader, right? And so that's something that I feel like I can have a strong point of view on. I bounced in and out of companies. I'm not really an employee. I can't handle it. I like doing my own thing, but I still have a point of view on this that I think that could be useful to other people.
Very cool. Yeah. And based on when I was doing research on you and your perspective, I look forward to seeing what you bring to the world in that regard. But I love that.
Thanks.
Let's dive into, because I'm really interested in your take and what's going on in the world. So the overarching concept that we're going to be talking about with a lot of people from a lot of different lenses here on this podcast is the concept of defining the future technologies, the advancement of humanity, and how all of those things play together. So not just technology for the sake of technology, and like, what does it actually mean to build the future together? What has your experience been in this realm? What's your involvement with it? Current state versus future state? Attack the 20 questions I just tossed over.
What's that? Yeah. What's my involvement with the future?
In defining the future.
I just think it's really, really hard. I think about this a lot, right? Because since I've been in advertising, it's grown a little bit, but also having printed a magazine, I've been in industries that have either struggled to grow or have shrunk. And, I'm mid-40s now. I've, 20, 30 years of work left. I don't know what it'll be. I'd love to be in an industry that's growing, and there are industries like healthcare. I think where people are coming together, doing things that the robots won't be able to do on their behalf. They're the places to probably be, unless you want to be the people creating the robots. And you've probably got these two big bundles of choice there: events, experiences, psychology, therapy, physical therapy, sport. Things that are physical in nature and bring people together, versus being the, more behind the scenes, looking at the technology of it all. But it's hard. I think this year's, for all of us who've been plugging through the pandemic and who've been fortunate enough to live in countries that are not war-torn, or featuring genocide, it feels trivial to kind of even contemplate some of these topics. But at the same time, some of us have families or mortgages or rents that we've got to pay, so we have to think about these things. Yeah. But I think for me, it's trying to develop businesses that are really, really needed by people and have a humanity at their core. That's what I'm interested in. Yep. The other stuff, I think, is probably smarter business play, to be in the pipes, to be in the wires, to be in the robotics of it all. But at this stage, less interesting to me. Did I answer one of those 20 questions?
You absolutely did. And to dig into that too, because one of the things that got me to spin up my own thing and take on the world was for that same reason, right? And it's for not building technology for the sake of technology, because it's advancing at hyperspeed now. And if we just do that, we're going to end up in a future that looks a lot like it does now, maybe a little bit worse, with just shinier tech. And I think there's a lot of potential, especially when we think of future technologies beyond just AI and blockchain that just swarms the media waves, but things like biotech, genomics, innovations in education, like you were alluding to with robotics, but also things like blended realities and what is the scale of this? And that's one of the things as well, as aside from people at the center of it. I was actually talking to my wife the other night when we were walking, and one of the questions I was interested in your perspective on what are some of the strategies and tactics that we can consider to ensure that as these technologies evolve and scale and popularize, that we do so in a way that it considers the societal impacts equally. So not just becoming accessible for the privileged communities of the world.
Yeah, I find those questions really difficult because they're about ethics and politics and policy, right? And I don't know how to have like a strong point of view on all of that, because I feel if I spend a lot of time in that space, that my head's going to be in the clouds because I'm not in politics. I can't affect policy. Ethically discussing it is it's not facile or useless to me, but there's other things that I need to focus on, like personally, like what am I going to do with the business next year?
Yeah.
How am I going to make rent? How am I going to, bring my team through, etc.
Yeah,
So
very true.
I find that those questions are super, super big. But let me contrast it with something, because I pay attention to where I get excited. I was over in Turkey recently, did a couple of operations, and I was like, oh my God, medical health tourism. I never really thought about getting involved with it until I experienced it. And there'll be, more and more robotics coming into that, and genomics and DNA things, etc. But if you think about, for a lot of people who do medical tourism, whether it's, getting a new heart or whatever it is, or a hair transplant, it can be really, really meaningful. It's not without risk, but these things can be really, really meaningful. And the patient experience is so complex and often very isolated. It can be high stakes, it could be low stakes. And I was like, oh my God. I took notes for days, for a couple of weeks, and I took daily videos while I was over in Turkey just to sort of document my experience in case it led me to new ideas. I just find that stuff more interesting, and it's easier for me to wrap my head around than sort of big questions about 100%. Tech. And on the one hand, I feel like it's so out of our control right now anyway. That question is going to butt up very quickly against billionaires who are, seem to be mentally not super stable, but also against countries like China and Russia and Saudi Arabia. And it's like, I don't know how to have a point of view on that. And also it's going to change so quickly potentially that having a point of view is almost useless. And the thing is that that's the goal of a lot of politicians. A lot of stuff that's been discussed and written about for the past couple of decades is like, if you can just confuse the masses enough so they don't know what to think, they, through survival, will just focus on what's in front of them, which allows other people to get away with stuff. And so I'm definitely playing along with that situation.
Yeah, and I wonder how much of that is, and not to go down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole, but I wonder how much of that is intentional versus just a side effect of them being confused and unclear about the direction of it all.
I think there's documented intentionality. Like, some of these,
Interesting.
like for example, if you look at Russia, what I find interesting is a lot of the leading politicians over the years have published their political philosophies as doctrine, as books. There's documentaries, for example, there's a great one by Adam Curtis that looks at, or it talks a little bit about how the current Russian president actually hired an absurdist theater maker as one of his main political advisors years and years ago. I don't know if the person's still alive or involved,
Really?
but their whole thing was like, if we just confuse everyone, then nothing's going to seem stable, which means that we can get away with anything. That documentary is on YouTube. It's called Hypernormalization. So there's definitely in a lot of countries an intentionality to it for sure. And then there's just a ruling class that, does things because they're used to doing things and used to seeking power. And then there are the side effects happen as well. So both things are true and both things happen.
That's really interesting, and thanks for sharing that. I'm definitely going to dive into that after this. And in that space, and talking about the contrast between these higher level questions, head in the clouds, and like being tactical, right? Because at the end of the day, yeah, we gotta live our lives, we gotta execute, especially those of us who are building and scaling businesses. What might be some tactical considerations that we could take when making decisions, or some strategies for having strategy imbued in our decision making?
Yeah, there's a couple of simple things that I think could apply to anyone who runs a business and who's run a business for a little bit of time. One is, what am I even doing here? Why do I get up? What animates me? And that's not a question that everybody in business needs to have an answer to. But
Sure.
if you are a meaning seeker, it helps to have a point of view on that and to tell yourself a story about why you do what you do. So, for example, for me, a lot of my training and a lot of the work that I do, it comes from me feeling the pain of people in the advertising industry who don't feel coached or mentored or trained, who feel stuck in bureaucracy, etc. Right? So that's one of the problems that I'm trying to solve, and I want to help people make the
Yeah.
most of their minds. So there's that. The second one is like, what's been working for us? So again, I think back through the past year, what we've been doing, we've had events that have really worked. We've had events and training that's not quite clicked. I said yes to a few things I didn't used to say yes to. So, for example, talking at conferences or doing a couple of things unpaid, which I stopped doing because I was too old for that. I told myself I didn't need to do things for exposure because when I was 20, around hip hop, which was my radio show magazine, everybody was trying to get everyone to do things for free or for $20. And when you're young, you do it a little bit. You can't do that stuff as you get older. But I said yes to a few things, and they've actually led to stuff, right? So what's been working? And then I think a third thing that, especially as you get a little bit older, is like, what don't I like doing? What don't I or what don't we like doing? So, for example, I don't know about you, I am exhausted by all of the technology that you have to run when you're running your own company. We've got WordPress plugged into Stripe with WooCommerce, with 10 to 15 paid for plugins. We've had Spotify, we've had Shopify, we've had Thinkific, Slack. Oh my God, I love you, Slack, but it's so annoying. I want a life without Slack. It's just and emails and newsletters, and it's just that stuff's exhausting. I'd love to have a much more minimal life and focus more on the creation of education and the delivery of education. So there are at least three places that I think that someone who's running your business can think about, and the decisions you make from that start to shape
Yeah.
broadly speaking, a strategy.
Love that. Thank you. I'm really interested. What was the trigger or the inspiration that got you to shift from the no's, which is so powerful to know what to say no to, and because every time you say no, it creates an opportunity where you can say yes to the things that are a little bit more aligned. But what changed to get you to say yes to a couple of the free things?
Well, I would say, there's a phase. It's not that I started to say no to a lot of stuff. I just didn't seek it out or put myself out there
Okay,
for certain things. But
makes
also, there
sense.
are just these things that we often do when we either go freelance or set up our own business, because there are these stories about, you need to have 100 coffees with people, you need to do this, you need to do that. And I went along with a lot of those ideas in the first year or two. The thing that changed is I became more assertive about what I thought I wanted to contribute to the world, and then I took responsibility for it.
Beautiful.
Again, folks who've worked in agencies, especially strategists, like when I catch up with them and they've just lost jobs or they've gone freelance, they're thinking all the same stuff, which is, oh, I could join a collective. And I'm like, that's not a business model. How's it going to work? Who's going to sell? Who's going to make money? That's not a thing. But all the strategists are like, I'm going to join a collective or create a collective. I want to work with a startup. And I'm like, yeah, do they have money? Do they know how to pay? Do they know how to use the work that you do? Probably not. Some of you have had great success with it, awesome, but generally speaking, not. But there are these things that people have to kind of go through, these fantasies that people have to go through until maybe through crisis, maybe through a sense of desperation, they're like, you know what? This is not working. I got to do something that's, for me at least, that's bigger. So I'm going to sit down and write that book I've been threatening to write for 5 years. I'm going to do
Beautiful.
these 5 things, and it becomes, there's a different energy that comes from it. And some people have that energy as kids, as teenagers, in their 20s, especially artists, right? But for a lot of us, especially people who've had to work out how to survive or shape themselves to corporate culture, it's hard because you have to shift your identity over 3 to 5 years. Your days look different, your routines look different. Whether you have status will feel different. So, yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And it's really interesting, especially people that in their core, and maybe haven't even defined it for themselves yet, but want something more or want to contribute at a larger level. The frequency at which you hit glass ceilings, or maybe not so glass ceilings, or get put in a box, especially in corporate environments, it can be frustrating. Talking to what we were talking about before, right, with wanting to do a handful of things or wanting to have a larger impact.
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of groups of questions that I like to ask people as they're thinking through career and life change. And I find this kind of conversation more interesting than, what's happening with artificial intelligence and
Sure.
what's happening.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh my God, because it's so big and it's scary.
Yeah.
One of the first questions that I think is worth asking yourself as you launch out on your own is, are you an employee, an entrepreneur, or an artist? Very simplistic. It's just three. It could be 10 things you can choose from, but employee, entrepreneur, or artist is a nice way to start to work out what you're about. If I'm talking with someone and they're like, oh, I'm an employee, it's like, okay, well, stop telling yourself all these fantasies about you setting up a restaurant in Costa Rica. Go get a job. Like, you just told me immediately that you're an employee and you need that structure, okay? An entrepreneur, to me, I know there's lots of different definitions, and this is not about having a correct definition. It's just having three categories that you can kind of pull apart in relatively clear and aggressive ways. An entrepreneur, to me, would be about building a business that has systems that can scale without necessarily the person operating it, right? Now, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm entrepreneurial. I haven't quite created those systems in my own business that for it to exist without me, because I'm so in the business as sort of the face of the business. So,
Yep.
and then there's an artist. Do you want to put raw truth into the world every day? So I find that stuff's interesting. And then the other question that I like to ask people is like, what are your verbs? And what that means is, what are you doing when you feel most alive? Often it's the stuff that we used to enjoy when we were younger. It's going to be things for me like writing, teaching, talking, interviewing, listening, walking around, traveling to cities. It's not fancy business language. It's very practical. But I truly believe that answering those two questions, and then potentially, is there a problem you could see yourself working at for the next 5 to 10 years, on one piece of paper, you start to develop a little strategy for your life in a way that people won't be able to take that from you, because it's your words and it's you, through self-awareness, knowing what you need to do and be in the world.
Absolutely love that. And it's a really interesting delineation that you have between employee, entrepreneur, and I love that artist is in there as its own flavor as well. And what I also find interesting, especially in the journey of entrepreneurialism, getting clear on the problems you want to solve in the world, what you want to do versus what you don't. But I think the first part that you spoke to is so fundamentally key, and a lot of people miss it, which is making sure that you have the systems and processes in place to scale, at least planning for it. So
If you want to
eventually,
scale.
if you want to scale or just sustain, but in a way that you don't create a job for yourself.
Yeah, which there's a really good early book on this called The E-Myth. It's been updated, The E-Myth Revisited. I think it's from the 1990s. And it talks about how a lot of people will buy a franchise or they'll set up a company to employ themselves again. And the author's like, you have to be aware that that's what you're doing. You're basically an employee who owns a business, but you're stuck to the business, which means you're an employee as opposed to the operator of the business. And it's not that one way is right or wrong. It's just be aware of it. And as you become aware of these things, you realize that you have options and you can work with more intention. Also in business, people will sometimes talk about, they'll ask someone, how are you going to scale? Or are you just creating a lifestyle business? And when they say lifestyle business, they're often kind of talking down to the person who's running a business. You can have a lifestyle business that's bringing in 200 grand, $500,000, $1 million if you're lucky. That's a good business. Like, you don't have to have a $50 million, $100 million business for you to be a successful human. And so I don't know, there's just these funny thoughts out there that get in the way of I don't know, they trigger people's ego, and then sometimes people make decisions that don't honor who they are, and they have to find that out through failure.
Oof. Tell me a little bit more about that, discovering that through failure.
Well, it's a cliche that failure is the best teacher. Literally, if you learn a language or you learn math or whatever you're into, you learn through making mistakes. It's the biggest
Absolutely.
cliche of actual education. But like I'd say, for me personally, moved to New York 12 years ago, was working in other companies for about 5 years, four different companies. Felt a little bit misled joining a few of them. Had a couple of good experiences, but also some not good experiences. For example, I joined an agency called Leo Burnett in New York to help run it, and they closed it down a month later. And I was like, oh, thanks for that. But through that experience, and then the next one that I took, I was like, I'm not an employee. Like deep down, I knew that, but I had decided to try to be one because I thought I had to be a more traditional family person, and have a mortgage and be the person who earned the money for the mortgage and all this sort of stuff, which is fine. I'm not upset about it at all.
Sure.
But through writing and teaching, through those difficult times, I was like, hang on, I feel really alive here, and I don't feel alive at all in any of the meetings that I'm in. So I was like, hang on, I must enjoy what I do. I'm just not enjoying where and how I'm doing it. So I was like, I'm out, and I'm going to build more of my life literally around my verbs. I love to write. I love to do silly drawings. And that's, it led to a book, it led to presentations, it's led to a company, But it took me, I'm not saying that I was following someone else's instructions, but it took a decade or two of me following a script that was out there in society and benefiting from that script. But then I just felt compromised and broken and things like that.
And what was the trigger that, like, because the tactic that you shared earlier in regards the few methods, and one of them being like get clear on what your verbs are. I think that's great, a great tool to help come to that awareness. But you didn't have you sharing these pointers before. What was the trigger that got you to realize, like, hey, wait a second, and got you to self-reflect on the fact that you were enjoying parts of what you were doing, but not others? Was there a clear trigger, or was it just?
I mean, it's years of just being like, hang on,
Repetition?
I want to quit this company again, and I've got no interesting work. What the hell? At some point, you got to look at yourself and go, dude, it might be you. But there is a big cultural difference between the industry that we're in here compared to Australia, for example. Australians don't like hierarchy. We're direct. We might use rude words in a meeting every now and then in a way that Americans can do, but generally don't do. You move to New York City, there's a lot of main character energy here. Everyone's a main character, and there's a lot of like old money connections, old family connections in the big companies you work in that you just don't have access to because you just arrived. And so it's really for years and years of that stuff happening and me being like, I'm not happy. I'm not solving my own problem by leaving one agency and going somewhere else, from going from Soho in New York to Brooklyn in New York. My Brooklyn experience was better in the agency there. But also around seven years ago, there was a little bit of an explosion of podcast things popping up on YouTube by people like Alan Watts. I read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. I read The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron, some classic stuff. I was watching a lot of videos and interviews with Carl Jung, or videos about Carl Jung, psychologist. And so I just sort of hit this moment that's way more mainstream now, but this moment where this stuff started to bubble up on the internet a little bit, and it just helped me understand myself, because my daily existence, even though yes, on paper I had good jobs and I was fortunate enough to earn good salaries, but in my head I was like, I don't feel like I fit in anywhere. Like I don't feel like I fit, and I didn't know who to talk to about it because New York's super corporate and competitive and high stakes. So it was really through these sources, many of which are decades old, that helped me, I don't know, just it shifted my energy. It shifted my energy. And there was a little bit of talk back then about the word responsibility as well. And responsibility is one of those words that in the US world is typically like a conservative word used at people to be like, hey, if you're poor, it's because you haven't taken responsibility for yourself. I don't embrace that point of view, not in a black and white sense. But the idea of like, well, if things aren't quite working out for you, if you're not quite happy, well, what are you going to do about it? And the thing that I love about having a business is like, you don't really complain that much, because you're like, well, what am I going to do about it? What's going to happen? I know that I will have a quiet December and January, so I'm giving myself projects to do. I'm booking in things in different countries for next year talking to my team about all the stuff that we're going to do. But I've been around long enough to know that, if you don't do that, you're not going to have a very nice December, January, possibly February. And so the word responsibility sort of popped up in different ways and was pretty important, I think, to me following through on, hey, sit down and write that book, mate.
Love it. Absolutely love it. One thing that I'm interested in your perspective on as well, and this kind of ties in, I love that you answered the one question about like what's important about like personal and professional reflectiveness of application of strategy. So just being really intentional on the actions you take. But how might you create the space outside of yourself, but amongst other people? And while it is a little bit of a more common practice, and it's information that's obviously information's everywhere right now, but it's more readily available and it's a mindset shift. You do have industries like the startup industry and like that politics and bureaucracy are a little bit more involved in, or it's who you know. And there are parts of the country and parts of the world, I'm sure, where it's more of a everybody helps each other kind of community. I've experienced some of those, but I've also been in places in the US where it's really cutthroat and it's kind of everybody out for themselves. How do you create safe spaces for people to have these awakenings or realization of the value of not just introspection, but safe spaces to collaborate and express themselves and work together?
Well, you answers in the question because the answer is, well, you do that, And so when I was running teams, but even when I wasn't, I would try to establish intentionally a particular culture for an interaction, like a workshop or a team meeting. When I was managing teams, I think one place there were about 12 strategists, I would start a weekly meeting with the question, what's a risk you've taken in the past week and how did it go? Now, that's a very simple question, but very important, because what it communicates is like, don't just sit on your hands, take a risk, do something that's a little bit different, but most importantly, learn from it. Because my point of view as a manager of some kind, I don't know if I was good at it, but I'd be good at it. I'd be okay at it now. But my point of view was I want people to develop. I want to create a self-developing organism in this team. And so we ran these mental workouts. We'd get together for an hour or so every week for a bit, and we'd like post rationalize stand-up comedy. We'd practice our thing, our stuff. And that came from reading books on behavioral economics and books on talent, how people get good at stuff. And I was like, hang on, how come the best people in the world practice basketball, whatever they're into, but in our industry, people tend not to, right? So the point is, if you're able to create spaces for people as a leader, official leader, or as an unofficial leader, you do it. And then you hope it catches on. No one else will do it.
And what if you're an individual that finds yourself in the spaces like a benefit from that opportunity, but you might not necessarily have the influence to just make that decision?
I mean, you can suggest doing it, or you just go and do it with people around your level. I remember we did 360 feedback, and there was someone in my team anonymously who was like, our meetings, there's too much like deep and meaningful conversation in our meetings. and I get that. But at the same time, I feel like I've read enough about how the brain works and how teams build and how vulnerability is useful, although it can be toxic, that I wanted that culture to be there. And, 10 years later, when I catch up with people who are in that culture, it was relatively unique. And I think a lot of them appreciated it and have bounced through corporate environments that were utterly toxic and they never felt safe. And so they've at least got that thing to look back on. And as they become leaders in the future, hopefully they'll be able to borrow and steal from all the good experiences they had and block out some of the bad experiences they had, whether it's with me or with anyone.
Love that. It's planting seeds and having that grow. One of the things that I found really interesting was the piece of content that you did, the isolated talks, that was one of my favorites that I've watched from you so far. where you were speaking about how you get caught in mental knots that last a while. And you remind yourself to operate and deal with whatever I think is most truthful right now, is, I believe, the quote.
Okay.
Can you tell me more about what that means?
Well, so the context for that is, I was asked to record a video for a group of people over in the UK who were getting a lot of people in advertising to talk largely about being locked down in the pandemic and mental health. And I've talked in public about mental health, and I've dealt with melancholy since I was a kid, depressive phases, suicidal rumination, cutting, all kinds of stuff when I was young. But some of that's just it's in me, and so I have these knots where I'm like, why do I suddenly feel sad? Why is that back again? Like, what just happened? And it could be that it's dark outside, or I had some conflict, or a song came on, or a memory came up. And so in the context of public speaking or writing, I am cherry picking stuff, but I'm like, what do I think is something I could say that is honest and true to the moment, but not necessarily too toxic. One thing that I started to do that I've toned down a little bit in the past few years, like I honestly got a little bit sick of it, which is it's going to sound funny when I explain what I started to do. But at the end of these days of training that I did with a friend, we'd have 50 to 100 people in a room around the world actually. And at the end, I would do this 15 to 20 minute thing called Strategy Upon a Strategist. And I would talk about some of the things that I saw growing up, some of the things that I felt growing up, mental health challenges, things that happened to family members, stuff like that. Really to make a point that we all go through these things. We don't talk about them, and sometimes when we don't talk about them, or when we keep them to ourselves, we sort of injure ourselves more. And what would happen is after the day would end, because that was generally the last or second last thing that we did, we'd go to a bar, and people would come, and some people would be crying, or some people would open up and tell each other their stories immediately, or just come up and say, "I thought it was just me." And I knew, because I was usually 5 to 15 years older than everyone, that me in my perceived role, which is not a thing I take too seriously, but in my perceived role talking like this, hopefully it just shows, especially to guys or people who identify as guys, like,
Okay.
it's okay to go through these things and to talk about them. And so, yeah, when I'm on stage, I'm like, what's something I could do that's pretty truthful and spontaneous? I'm a little concerned that some of it could come across as trauma bombing, which wasn't a phrase that I knew 5 years ago when I started to do this. But it's I'm yearning for a real connection with people, And like, I was over in Georgia doing this thing on stage, running a guy, Lado Malazzonia, a lovely creative director and strategist, through my workshop in front of 1,000+ people, I think. And he ended up quitting his job at JWT on stage. So they're the kind of real moments that I need in my life. I'm kind of addicted to stand-up comedy and things like that, because I just, I can't handle the corporate America thing. I can't handle dealing with robotic people. I can't handle transactional interactions. I hate being sold to. I just want to be like, have my head in some barrel of just amazing, interesting human truths. And so that's my fetish and addiction.
I love that. And did you mention at the beginning of this, though, that you don't do too much of that anymore?
Yeah, I turned it down a little bit. I get into... I was getting a bit bored of hearing myself do it. And I did a TEDx talk about 11 years ago where, I talked about some of the stuff that my family had been through.
Yeah.
And in my head, I was like, maybe this will cure me of decades of melancholy. And it didn't. It didn't. But then people would sort of keep talking to me about their things. And so I started to talk about some of my things, and then got a little bit tired of it, to be honest. And, there could be an element of it that's a bit toxic. But sometimes I'll do it a little bit quickly, make people cry a little bit. And I don't know. At least they're going to remember that interaction.
At the very least, yeah. But that's really interesting, right? There is it seems like a fine line between having that space to be vulnerable and acknowledge it, but not crossing the threshold to the point where it has adverse or non-productive effects.
Yeah, it's hard to know, because again, someone who might never have opened up could say, "Oh gosh, I thought it was just me. I mean, I talked about going to Turkey. I got a hair transplant in Turkey, and I get messages from guys who are going to Turkey to get hair transplants, and they're not telling anybody else. And they're asking me, on day 8, could I go back to work? Would my boss know what had happened? I'm like, yes, your boss will know what had happened. And I get these lovely messages from people who are thinking about doing it, who are doing it. Also from women who may be, doing Botox, and they're talking to me about that experience, or women who've lost hair, who've had it replaced. And so I'm trying to be a little bit out there, because I know you just feel less insane when you're like, oh, that person's gone through something similar to me,
Yeah. And I think there's something innate in the human connection, kind of the quiet meaning for life that we all search for, in that relatability and in that uncertainty almost. It's nice to be able to have a space to connect over things like that. So that's great.
Yeah.
And then to loop into one other thing that was interesting from that talk is you said something to the effect of it's important to explore a creative life. And when somebody hears that can mean something to you right away. But I'm wondering what a creative life might mean from your perspective, outside of just the standard, what we were talking about earlier, in regards to like being an artist, or like the traditional definition of what creativity is.
Yeah, it's just what I said earlier, when it's like, what are your verbs? What problem you're trying to solve? And then how are you going to bring all of that to life? Like, I need to self-express. I can't stay in my head the whole time. Maybe if I moved to a small town and I didn't have financial stress all the time, or other kinds of stresses, I could meditate and do yoga and do weights and try to eat healthy and have a little job. Maybe I'd be okay. But I think my brain's too manic at times. Like, not in a diagnosed way, but it's just chatting, right? And I've had phases of yoga and the meditation. It's calmed things down. But really, what I'm trying to say in that sentence, which when I hear it back from you feels super generic, not because of you, but because of the words. What I'm trying to say to people is, it's cool to get paid to be creative for a company, but it's much cooler to be creative for yourself. And people can put that second bit off for years and years and years and years, in a way that will affect their mental health, in a way that could actually minimize business opportunity and money in the future, because they're like, oh, I want to write a book. And it's like, bro, no one knows you, so no one's going to publish your book, and you don't have a newsletter, you don't have a following anywhere, so who's going to buy it? Like, maybe a 1 in a billion chance that it does well, but like, you got to be out there and doing things. And so that's really what that quote's trying to get at. Don't just serve timesheets if you're in an agency, but to put some of your time aside, which can be really hard if you're doing 60 to 80 hours or whatever it is a week, which a lot of people do.
Very true too. Very true too. One of the things that hearing you speak about that, to offer an additional layer of consideration, in addition to defining clearly the things that mean something to you, what if creativity could just mean a different way of threading together things that are important to you in a unique way to craft a life, to craft a space.
Yeah, well, like I'll define the words, because I agree. So, I paraphrase Edward de Bono a lot, and Edward de Bono, I think he coined, or at least promoted, the phrase lateral thinking and the phrase linear thinking. So creativity to me is the act of having ideas and putting them into the world. Well, I guess it's two acts, really. It's having ideas and putting them into the world. That's what creativity is. What's an idea? It's bringing at least two things together that don't usually exist together in a way that creates new meaning and new value. So yeah, I agree by definition with what you just said.
I love that. And that expanded the definition of creativity for me as well. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
So there's a couple other things that you hinted at that you're diving into recently, and there's this little drop in a pond that I'm selfishly interested in hearing about, and you kind of mentioned it earlier. But your next book, I think, debating the topic was the 3 words that you associated with it.
Yeah, like I'm sitting on about four different things right now. I made a course called Write Yourself into Public this year, which is, on our website. I put it on Skillshare too. And what I was trying to do there is especially when I travel, because in New York I don't really get out and talk to people that much. Everyone's working, and the people I know are in different places, and they're traveling and working long hours. And so it's really when I travel, people will want to talk to me about like writing on LinkedIn or doing a podcast or writing a book. And so I created this cheeky framework called oh my gosh, I've just forgotten. Hang on. I hope you can edit that out. Anyway, I created this cheeky framework to try to get people to come in, to get in touch with why they would want to communicate in public. What are you desperate about? So I use the word desperation. The framework's called the Adept as Fuck System for Savage Self-Expression. So the Adept as Fuck, and then AASSSS or something like that. Ass. So it's a bit of fun, right? And so I was going to turn it into a book, and I think I would like to. I think I could reach a lot of people. I'm intimidated. It's a bigger audience than the strategy audience. This little book that I wrote, we raised about $37,000 on Kickstarter. It sold 7,500 copies. Most books are not profitable. Most books don't sell more than a few copies on average. I've seen different pieces of research, different studies. Maybe on average it's 200. So it's done really, really well, and it's helped us survive. Nice. Literally helped us survive. So it's hard to work out what the next thing is, but there's that. Write Yourself into Public as a book. The research that I'm doing on in-house teams and this little operating model that I've got, I think that could probably be a better book to write right now. And then I'm also sitting on a couple of novel ideas. One's called How to Quit Advertising. Started to play with this thought about 10 years ago. It's a very violent book though. But what I was going to do, and I probably shouldn't talk about things I was going to do or whatever,
Sure.
do the thing. But what I was going to do is create a revenge novel that kind of resembles the how-to stuff that I do to try to confuse people and have this universe of fiction and non-fiction coming together. That's the book I would write if I was brave. I'm totally scared. And then I started to also play with this book, asking the question, could you, this will seem a little bit rude. A lot of people die by suicide by jumping in front of trains. And I was like, could I write a comedy about that? So there you go. There's four things that have four ideas that have stuck with me for a very, very long time. The in-house one is something that I've been playing loosely with for about 5 years, but I was just focusing elsewhere. But I'm feeling an urgency around it this week. So I think that's probably the next one.
What's leading to the sense of urgency?
Conversations with people, just also conversations with people working with big companies and seeing how ambitious the people I interact with are, and then the bureaucracy they have to deal with. Strategically, it makes sense because, these in-house teams, it's not that they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger, although they are. This year's sort of wiped out a few teams. Well, they're not as big as they were, but compared to 10 years ago, there are way more people who do this kind of work who are in-house, and agencies are struggling. Agencies don't always have budgets. They don't like spending money on their people. And so I think from a business point of view, it makes sense. I've got the experience to talk about it, and I've got a point of view on it that I think could help a lot of people. So those three things are coming together to make it feel like it's time.
Very cool. Well, coming from a place of ignorance, having never written a book, but hearing from people that have, I conceptually understand the undertaking. So I'm not going to ask why not more than one, but why a book as a medium for this one that you're feeling the urgency for versus a different medium or delivery method?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I'm super intentional when I write when I write books. When I wrote this book, I sat down. I was like, what are the things that I've heard from other people that I believe in or don't believe in? So one of them is a business book is like a business card. I hate that. I hate it. And so my answer to that was like, I want to write a book that feels like art. And maybe that sounds pretentious, but what that means to me is I can take creative risks that most people probably wouldn't do. So this book that I wrote, Strategies of Words, it has a lot of absurdism in it. It's for some people, it seems like it's in their head, it's reading them. For some people, they say to me, it's the first time I've seen myself in a book, and it's super weird, and I love that. But it's not for everyone. It's not for everyone. But having said that, the word book really has become shorthand for a chunky piece of IP.
Yeah.
right? And so when I create a chunky piece of IP, I think about how to flywheel it. So the strategy is your words. I wanted to, there are things that I've not done, partly because of the world and partly because of just trying to build a business. I wanted to create like a pop-up store where I'd turn some of the metaphors in the book and the techniques in the book into, like a walk around, like a museum situation where, maybe there's a little area where you can try to play with an insight. And I don't know what's going on there. The opening chapter talks about this famous Italian footballer, Andrea Pirlo, but also Inigo Montoya from The Princess Bride. Maybe there's some puppet show that happens with them, but basically to turn the symbols and the techniques in the book into something experiential. I've thought about turning it into like a 3-hour movie, and not in a way where I take myself super seriously, but I was like, could probably do that. But right now it's a book and a course and my talk. So we've hit maybe 3 and social posts and emails. So there's like 4 or 5 arms to the current book. But it's a valid question. And if I was talking to somebody about writing a book, which I did 2 days ago, I would say the same thing.
Cool.
It's not just a book. You got to think bigger and more long term.
That's a great point. And that might be the basis for the answer to this follow-up question. But you mentioned that the recent conversations that you've been having is what's leading you to lean toward this particular book versus the nonfiction novel that you said you would write if that was the one you would write if you were brave.
The fiction
Which
novel,
to me
not the nonfiction
screams.
novel. Yeah.
Oh, okay, I think it's fiction, right?
Yeah.
Okay. That to me screams, especially with what you were saying before, with like being true to your calling and being aware of what you were going to do. Like, isn't that a clear direction for you? And where's that opposition?
Of course. I mean, I used to talk about this. This is not original, but do what scares you. And so if there's a thrill, I'm like an intellectual adventure seeker. I know that. Probably more an intellectual adventure seeker than a physical adventure seeker. I realized this year, this came to me when I was on stage the other day. I was like, oh my God, I literally travel advertising. That's what I do. So that's a weird thing. I hadn't put those words together, but I was like, dude, that's literally what you do. The things that scare us are sometimes the things to do. If I could get the business, here we go. If I could then, if I could get the business to the point where other people are running a lot of it, then it would free me up psychologically, but also free up my days to do it. Because for me to write a book, I would want to have, a few months where I could get 3 to 5 hours every morning, nearly every morning, 3 to 5 mornings a week to really just have at it, right? But also I would have to go through a lot of history in my head, which sometimes I don't like doing because I was literally going to try to put a lot of things I'd seen and things that family members have been through into the book. Hypothetically speaking, don't sue me. And I don't know, I'd have to be in a good place or away from the world or something, right? That's the story that I'm telling myself right now. It'll happen. Like I'll write this book. Don't you worry. I'll write this book.
Good.
I got some
because I want to read it.
Revenge to commit.
What's different between that one and the one that you're going to write, though? Don't you need that space to write in general, or do you find that there's a different balance to based on the content?
Yeah, well, the one that I'll probably do, which we'll focus on in-house, I'll maybe cap it at, say, 200 to 250 words versus 250 pages versus 400, which is a lot. 400 pages is like 80,000 words. So, I might try to come in at, say, 40,000 to 60,000 words. But the thing is, it won't be as big a psychological undertaking for me. It's more investigative. It's, talking about things that I've thought about a lot versus me, writing basically a violent book. It's a different form of violence for sure, but it's
and energy management is super important in everything. So it's good that you're consciously.
Yeah, but also like I'm feeling kind of pathetic even explaining this to you because it's like just be quiet and write the book, dude. So so I understand why a lot of people who write or who create things, they basically do what Stephen King says to do, which is write with the door closed. And what he means by that is if you're going to write, Don't tell everybody about it all the time. There's research about that, by the way, because in telling other people, the brain thinks it's achieved something and then it's less likely to try to achieve it.
Yep.
But also, the reason that I don't mind talking about it is, first of all, I have written a book and I've done stuff and I continue to do stuff. Yep. But also, I like talking about these things so that people who've never done it but who really want to do it can understand that it's not easy. And like maybe they're like, oh, okay, that guy's written a book, but also he's kind of confused about what to do next. I relate to that. Maybe it'll make it easier for me to write my book. So I think there's a bit of a small public benefit to talking about the things as they're happening.
100%. I appreciate it. And I'm sure the people that are hearing that and resonate with it are appreciating that as well. And then I'll ask this question just to ask, again, with selfish interest. But you've been teasing at an app potentially. You obviously have a ton of trainings and stuff. So what might that be, just to plant the seed now so we can keep our eyes on the market?
Yeah, it's a top, like I said, I've worked creating digital products and websites and online marketing stuff for a long time, and the world doesn't necessarily need more apps. Not every company needs an app. But also, remember what I was saying about feeling exhausted by all the tech that we've got running right now. It's up, it's down, it's getting hacked. There's 10,000 attacks in an hour. I'm like, what the hell's going on? And so part of me is yearning for a more minimalist and a calmer business life, to be honest. We have business issues that I would want to try to solve with an app. For example, we do a lot of events, but a lot of our invitations and emails get into people's spam folders, so they don't realize that there's an event on that they're able to come to because they're a member. We've got community. We've tried Facebook. We've got nearly 20,000 people in the Facebook group, but the interaction has not died off, but it's way less than what it was in 2019, as people left Facebook. We've tried Slack. We tried an online message board. We've tried all these things. And it's challenging because it's a competitive and kind of private group of people in advertising. They're pitching against each other. They're nervous about their bosses seeing what they're writing about. And I know that because I get the DMs, can you post this for me? Because I have this question, but my boss is in your group. So I'm like, well, maybe we can move the community over. Does somebody want to look at their phone for a 45-minute lesson? Probably not. Might they use their phone if I could create a little artificial intelligence co-pilot where I pump all my stuff into it and then train the thing basically like how to think a little bit like me? Maybe, but maybe that's better on desktop. So, got to work through all of that. But my initial focus is going to be on getting this in-house thing cranking.
Yep.
Because that's been on the back of my mind, and then I want to see, what's doable for an app for sure.
Cool. Very cool. And in regards to the projects that you want to undertake that are beyond what you're doing in the world, there is a book that I've just started and that people speak praises to called Buy Back Your Time by Dan Martell. Are you familiar with it?
No.
The concept is in a tiered and evolutionary way, freeing up your time to focus on the things with the largest impact, so that you can eventually step out and create a space for you to do the work that you want to do.
Yeah.
So I'll pass that recommendation along to you.
But on that, like yesterday, this week I've had a few hours where I was paying invoices, right? Little things.
Sure. Yep.
And if you follow some of the thinking that's out there, especially around small business, anything that you could outsource, you should try to outsource. Every year you should, quote unquote, fire yourself from a job, which means, if you can grow, bring someone in to take something from you. At the same time, there is something nice about being connected to some of the smaller moments. It helps you think a little bit about the business. And maybe it just relieves the brain for a day or two to do some stuff that's not about being creative and thinking. In a perfect world, yeah. I mean, if I could write books all day, do a talk on a stage in a different country every couple of weeks, launch a YouTube channel with great videos, publish other people, etc. I'd love to do that. But sometimes being in the weeds is okay. And I say that just because for those people who are starting out on their own, you get all these narratives sort of forced at you.
Oh, that's true too.
And it's often yes, and maybe a little bit of something else as well. So just wanted to offer that as maybe a counterpoint.
Cool. I appreciate that. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been an incredible conversation. I've really enjoyed the time together.
How'd you do for your first podcast?
I don't feel nervous. I've enjoyed the conversation. How did I do for my first podcast?
Yeah, how do you think you went for your first podcast?
Feels good. It was a conversation, which was nice. Where can people go to follow you, or how should they reach out?
My name Mark Pollard on Instagram, LinkedIn, sweathead.com has all of our classes and books, or my book as well. So they're the main places.
Awesome. And I know that one of your goals for this upcoming year was to provide training for companies. So how should people reach out to you like that? Do you have a preferred channel?
Yeah, they can DM me, they can email me, mark.pollard@sweathead.com. And it's funny, it's like from next week, actually, I'm going to start communicating in a more explicit way. And I just realized for the first 3 to 5 years of me running a business, I didn't really tell people what I was doing. And I think it's like some of us have had careers where we've helped other people and other companies tell the world what they're doing, but we get awkward about it. We're like, oh, do I want to be that kind of person? And so I'm increasingly trying to be that kind of person. I share my goals or half thoughts on the internet. There's all this stuff I want to do next year in different places. And I'm like, hey, if you're in this country and you want to do a thing, let me know. Because I just find that putting stuff out, it does really help things happen.
Yeah.
And when one thing happens, then all of a sudden, a ton of stuff can happen. And it's kind of why I do it. But yeah, they can DM me or email me if they want to get their company trained.
Very cool. And that kind of ties into one of the things that you were mentioning earlier, like for the people that want to, for instance, write a book, but don't necessarily have that channel established or a community established, the supporting elements. So that's something I've personally been starting to implement more recently, is like getting my personal voice out there. There's a lot of value in that, having that channel of communication to form those relationships.
Yeah, you have to have some kind of channel or celebrity set up. Otherwise, someone else won't publish you. And if you publish yourself, super difficult unless you just got a ton of money and can pump it into paid advertising, or you're super strategic with paid search or just SEO, right? So you've got to build your network before you need it, And then there's a thought out there with some of the social media people that you should delay charging people for anything until you really need to, right? Because as soon as you start to bring money into the equation, people start to see you a little bit differently. Some people can resent you. So that's a thought that's out there as well.
Is it a thought that's worth challenging? Is it another one of the stories that we tell ourselves, or is there
Yeah, it's both. It's both.
A non-sleazy way to approach that? Right?
You just gotta do what feels right for you.
Yeah.
But very hard to launch a product out of nowhere. Very difficult. Especially if your name's on the product, right? You need some kind of network, connection, fame, power, money, whatever it is. Otherwise, it's a really hard game. Yeah. And if you want proof of that, just go to Reddit and find the subreddits where people are talking about publishing books or making products. Even small businesses, we know this. Most small businesses don't last more than a couple of years.
Yeah. You need some anchor of credibility or influence.
Yeah. And for people who are in large companies, this is on my mind a lot because I get messages from people who have just lost jobs or about to lose a job. They're not sure what they want to do. If you're in a big company with a big role, that's when you want to start to go public, because when you leave, you're less interesting to people because you can't hire them. They can't look good by interacting with consultant X. So if you're in a place of perceived status, that's when you want to start getting active, build that network. And then you'll have sort of a group of people to work with later. Otherwise, it's much harder. Not impossible, but just harder.
Awesome. Love that. Thank you for the final nuggets.
No worries.
Looking forward to keeping in touch.
Woody. Give you an Aussie nickname, Woody.
That is a nickname that goes around the family. I appreciate it.
Tell them it's an Aussie nickname. You just learned. It's not. I'm making it up. I'm making it up.
Okay, well, I believed you. I am not a gullible person, but I actually believed you on that. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining in. I hope you got value out of the conversation. Thank you again, Mark Pollard.
Nice.
You have been an incredible conversation that I will remember moving forward. So make sure to reach out to him at Mark Pollard and at Sweathead. And thank you all again. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, man.